Hello, my name is Jennifer Blisle, and I have chosen to compare the Texas City explosion of 1947 to the Northridge earthquake of 1994. I wanted to choose these events that are decades apart to see if the emergency response has improved or changed over the years. It's important to note that both of these events are pre-Hurricane Katrina, which was more of a monumental shift in emergency response. First, I want to give a little background on these events in case you're like me and were unfamiliar with these disasters. The Texas City explosion was caused by ammonium nitrate that started on fire. Crews didn't want to ruin the cargo, so they actually only used small amounts of water and an extinguisher to try and put the fire out, but their efforts were not enough. This then led to the first explosion, which resulted in various other fires and another explosion at the Monsanto Chemical Storage Facility. The combined events resulted in over 450 deaths with various unidentified victims and a large number of injuries. Nearly half a century later, the Northridge earthquake happened only a few states over in California. As a result of this natural disaster, one of the busiest freeways was actually destroyed and took an extensive period of time to repair. Many buildings were destroyed in this event, which also took years of maintenance. This disaster caused over 60 fatalities. Now I want to dive a little deeper into the response of the Texas explosion. So whenever a disaster strikes, having people willing to help is crucial. Thankfully, in this case, the cities of Galveston, Houston, San Antonio, they all sent policemen and firefighters to assist with the police department in Texas City in order to maintain order following the explosion. The U.S. Army flew in blood plasma, gas masks, food, and other supplies. They also provided bulldozers to begin clearing wreckage and set up temporary housing for the survivors in Camp Wallace and Hitchcock. Various military branches and other organizations sent over personnel, including doctors, nurses, and ambulances. The Red Cross, Salvation Army, and the Boy and Girl Scouts of America sent a flood of volunteers who provided first aid, food, water, and comfort to the city residents, and volunteers from other local organizations and those who weren't even a part of an organization felt compelled to offer help where they could. There was also no operational hospital in Texas City due to the explosion, so volunteers converted the City Hall and the Chamber of Commerce buildings into temporary housing and hospitals. Many wounded were evacuated to neighboring hospitals due to the large number of injuries, and temporary housing was also built and donated to the city, and other housing docks, warehouses, and chemical plants were rebuilt by 1950, so a pretty quick turnaround there. These rescue workers, victims, and medical personnel moved to the disaster relief stations for medical services and to offer different resources. And some of those resources included the food, water, and other things that I had previously mentioned. Communication was difficult right as the explosion happened because at the time there was a telephone operator strike occurring. So when the operators learned of the accident, they quickly went back to work. But unfortunately, there was still a delay in getting the lines of communication back up initially. The impact of the explosion and those following, both businesses and people were affected. The Texas City Fire Department was left limited in their volunteers following the explosion, as only one member remained alive. All the equipment for the firefighters were ruined by the fire, including 4 fire trucks. All the cargo that was on the ship was destroyed, which totaled 2,300 tons, which is interesting to me given they wanted to not use water or extinguishers on it to try and preserve the cargo on the ship. The surrounding buildings, including the Monsanto Chemical Company, grain warehouses, oil and chemical storage tanks, and local businesses were also destroyed. And in total, it was believed that $67 million in property damage was created as a result of this incident. As for the human impact, many of those that were killed included spectators to the fire. So they had actually believed that they were far enough away from the ship at the time of the explosion to avoid injury, but unfortunately they had underestimated the distance that the debris could travel. There were less spectators near the second explosion at the Monsanto chemical plant, but over 200 staff members were still killed. As a result of the death of these workers and spectators, many became widows children became orphans, and temporary housing was offered to those who lost their homes in the disaster. Many lessons were learned from this explosion in Texas City, specifically relating to the ammonium nitrate or other explosive compounds. It is now known to treat it as an explosive device. The precautionary measures during this disaster were not fitting to what could have and did happen that day. It was learned that the first responders were not equipped with the appropriate personal protective equipment, or PPE, for situations like this. The best course of action in these types of situations is to evacuate the area and isolate the scene, which we now know, given the spectators thought that they were far enough away. And it's important to call for help. Again, with the strike that was happening, this was very difficult to accomplish. The review of the Emergency Response Guidebook, or the ERG, will help you guide in making decisions appropriate for that of the event you're experiencing. In an incident like this one, the ERG says to evacuate a half a mile away from the explosion. Now, shifting gears to the Northridge earthquake and their response to the tragic event, receiving financial assistance can greatly help the efforts of disaster response. So FEMA awarded California Geological Survey nearly $20 million to accelerate the zoning of earthquake hazards under the Seismic Hazards Mapping Act of 1990. The seismic hazard zones, or zones of required investigation, delineated where this is a high likelihood of these hazards occurring in the future earthquake events. Local city and county permitting agencies are required to request special geological and engineering studies to be performed within these zones prior to land development and construction. So from here on out, if you decide to do land development and construction, you do have to have these studies performed. The California Conservation Corps began recovery work the very next day following the 1994 Northridge earthquake in Southern California. Corps members devoted 1,700,000 hours to dismantling hundreds of hazardous chimneys. The final response highlighted here was a visit by members of the administration. Within hours of Northridge quake, these members joined with the then Mayor Richard Riordan to assess the damage and begin recovery efforts. The president, vice president, and key cabinet members at the time also all flew out to the area 3 days later for full public conference with state and local emergency relief officials and leaders in nonprofit relief efforts. FEMA Director James Lee Witt at the time was also increased his presence days following the quake with various leaders, and they actually spent long evenings walking through the temporary tent cities, or kind of like the temporary housing that they had, set up by displaced residents, to listen to their stories and their experiences that they had. There was significant financial impact from this 6.7 magnitude earthquake, which is why the financial assistance was extremely helpful for this event. The quake caused up to $20 billion in damage costs, plus $40 billion plus in economic loss, making it the costliest earthquake disaster in U.S. history. While many businesses remained closed in the days following the quake, some infrastructure were not able to be rebuilt for months or even years later. Many were unable to recover financially and actually had to close their businesses permanently. For example, the Northridge Fashion Center was virtually destroyed and did not open for more than a year and a half. To put this into perspective, 57% of Los Angeles businesses in the affected area reported experiencing some type of direct physical damage due to the earthquake. The human impact of the earthquake related mostly to job loss because of the business impacts previously mentioned. So 69,014 person years of employment. This is just how they measure the number of hours completed by an individual throughout the entire year, was actually lost resulting from the earthquake. With the help of subsequent federal grants, the California Conservation Corps was able to hire nearly 200 young people from the area directly impacted by the quake. This created jobs for the youth, which helped rebuild the community and become involved. 82% of all the structures rendered uninhabitable by the earthquake were residential buildings, leaving 22,000 people homeless. So the lessons learned from this event are similar to that of the explosion of Texas City. Aram Sakian, the general manager of the City of Los Angeles Emergency Management Department, said that he encourages you to make the necessary precautions today and practice drills and plan ahead. So reflecting back on the explosion discussed earlier, preparedness to this type of event would have reduced the loss of life. By maintaining local hazard mitigation plans that outline the earthquake hazards, we have identified specific projects to mitigate or lessen the effects of the impact of the earthquake. In addition, each city department is required to develop and maintain a department emergency plan that outlines and dictates department-specific roles and responsibilities to a variety of hazards and all hazards approach. So it doesn't just limit it to the hazards that they experience, it's all hazards. These department emergency plans must meet National Incident Management System, or NIMS, criteria as well, and standards outlined by the city's Emergency Management Department, or EMD. Many of the buildings have been retrofitted up to a decade after the event to withstand severe shaking, but one can still face many hazards and dangers. However, they have learned how vulnerable certain types of buildings are and how being trained to help other neighboring cities is essential. SCC and the many ECA partner organizations and leaders work to communicate these and other lessons through activities such as the Great California Shakeout preparedness messaging, such as the 7-step to earthquake safety, and guidance on what to do when an earthquake early warning. There's this app that is called Shake Alert LA, so they receive notifications if an earthquake is going to happen in the area. This lesson, I feel, varies a bit different from the explosion due to buildings being unable to be adapted to explosions. This is more focused on earthquake response and lessons learned relating to that. Hopefully, as we evolve as a society, we can continue to learn lessons and grow our prevention and response to tragic events similar to these. Thank you.